Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to our Bioethics Grand Round webinar. Before we begin, we would like to open with a quick word of prayer.
Let's bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for bringing people here today and our speakers here today. And please be with us as we discuss this weighty topic, how to walk alongside people and our patients and others that we're trying to help. Lord, thank you for all of our presenters today. Please be with them and just ask that a portion of your grace and blessing be upon us. In your name I pray.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wee. So the Bioethics Grand Round, this one is very special because it is Grand Round is co-sponsored by the Center for Christian Bioethics as well as the Center for Whole Person Care here at Loma Linda University. So we're very happy to collaborate on this Grand Round. The title of this Grand Round is The Willingness to Enter into the Chaos of Another, the Ethics and Practice of Accompaniment in Healthcare. So something about, let me just say a few words about the Center for Christian Bioethics. The Center for Christian Bioethics mission is to continue the teaching and healing ministry of Jesus Christ by uniting service with bioethics scholarship. And service could mean that clinical service as well as advocacy at large in our communities to address issues of health equity and policy. But today's webinar is special because we want to ask the question of what is a Christian's clinician calling when facing patients who experience poverty, oppression, and other forms of social marginalization. We want to ask, how might Christian faith transform the ethos and practice of healthcare? So I want to ask everyone to join us as we have four wonderful panelists who are going to be drawing on the theological idea of accompaniment. And sketch a vision of healthcare that is not afraid of entering into the chaos and suffering of patients. So there are four driving questions for our webinar today. The first one is, what is the concept of accompaniment? What is this theological concept? Why is it important in healthcare? The second question. And the third one is, what are its ethical dimensions? And what does it actually look like in practice? Each panelist will have about 15 minutes to present their presentation, followed by a response to the panel as a whole by Dr. Saul Barcelo. And right now, I will be introducing our first speaker, Phifer Nicholson. Phifer Nicholson is a Theology, Medicine, and Culture Fellow at Duke Divinity School and an MD candidate at Duke School of Medicine. He is planning on pursuing a surgical career with professional and research interests, including health equity, the intersection of theology and medicine, medical ethics, and global health. One more thing before Phifer takes it away is that at the end of our panel discussion here, we're going to have some time for a Q&A from the live audience. So if you would like to post a question or a comment, I invite you to use the Q&A tab on the Teams app. And post your question there, and I will then read the question to the panelists for you. So our first panelist, Phifer, the time is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. One thing I'm just going to let you all know, I think technically if you folks are having trouble logging into the webinar that I'm hearing from people, so I just wanted to let you all know that before I get started. But if you could bring up my slides, that would be super helpful. So as Yishen introduced, my name is Phifer Nicholson. I am grateful. First of all, I want to say thank you to Yishen, to Saul, to Grace, to Olivia, and to all at the Center for Christian Bioethics who have made this panel possible. I wish we could have gathered in person, but this cross-country webinar will suffice for now. For this section of the panel, I've been tasked with introducing accompaniment as a concept and its importance to the practice of medicine and medical institutions. I will then hand it off to Doctors Casarella, Block, and Lyon to explore the ethical dimensions of accompaniment, as well as what it might look like in practice. It would be remiss of me to fail to acknowledge that I'm presenting on this topic alongside people that I admire deeply and who have done much of the foundational work in developing accompaniment as a theological and an ethical framework. They also live it. It's an honor to be presenting with people I consider my teachers and who have also become my friends. Next slide. I have no disclosures. On to the next one. Thank you. I'll start briefly by introducing my first encounter with accompaniment. Before starting medical school, I spent a year teaching English in Ramallah, Palestine with the local Lutheran church. Our time there as American volunteers was framed by the Palestinian local bishop, Munib Yunan, with the word accompaniment. It means to journey with the people, as Yahweh did in traveling in the desert with the wayward people of Israel, or to join with companions on the move, as Jesus did with the frightened disciples on the road to Emmaus. Yunan argues that accompaniment took root in the flesh in God's incarnation when God became one of us. Near Bethlehem, I encountered a community health worker project called Health for Palestine in a refugee camp called Aida, a picture of which is featured here. This was started by locals and an international team. One of the international partners, a physician sociologist, emphasized to me that the heart of the program is social accompaniment of the local patient population by community health workers who themselves are from the camp. This accompaniment includes frequent home visits, attending specialty appointments, helping the patients with medication adherence, and simply listening to and walking with patients as they navigate their health amid poverty, military occupation, and a fragmented healthcare system. I was surprised to find that this word that I had begun to associate with the theological tradition was also being used by a secular NGO to frame its engagement with grassroots organizing and a community health worker program. Next slide. I wasn't able to fully conceptualize this connection until my friend Brendan Johnson gave me a book entitled In the Company of the Poor, Conversations with Dr. Paul Farmer and Father Gustavo Gutierrez, both of whom are in this picture, edited by my co-panelist, Dr. Jenny Weiss-Block. In the introduction, Dr. Block describes that the Latin origin of the word accompaniment is cum pane, literally meaning with bread. The word implies a sharing of resources and time, pointing to mutuality and even friendship. The values that comprise accompaniment have a long history rooted in various religious traditions, yet accompaniment as a theological and ethical response to injustice traces its roots to Latin American liberation theology and Latinx theology. Accompaniment was first explicitly used in the 1970s by Saint Oscar Romero. Chilean priest theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, known as the father of liberation theology, uses accompaniment to frame the praxis of a preferential option for the poor and marginalized. Next slide. Latinx theologian Roberto Goizueta further expanded our understanding of accompaniment into an ethic of solidarity, shared resources, proximity, advocacy, and friendship with particular poor persons. He writes, could you please bring up the quote? "We are happy to help and serve the poor, as long as we don't have to walk with them where they walk. That is, as long as we can minister to them from our safe enclosures. The poor can remain passive objects of our actions rather than friends, compañeros and compañeras with whom we interact. As long as we can be sure that we will not have to live with them and thus have interpersonal relationships with them, we will try to help the poor, but again, only from a controllable geographical distance." For Goizueta, the key difference accompaniment makes is that one must become geographically and physically proximate to the person or community they are seeking to accompany. Next slide. And next slide, please. In the world of medicine and healthcare, uptake of accompaniment as a means of engaging with disease and disparity can be traced to the work of the late physician anthropologist Paul Farmer. Gutierrez, Goizueta, and other liberation theologians significantly influenced Farmer's approach to clinical care and research throughout his career. In his seminal essay on the insights from liberation theology in healthcare titled Health, Healing, and Social Justice, Farmer writes, next slide, "To those concerned with health, a preferential option for the poor offers both a challenge and an insight. It challenges doctors and other health providers to make an option, a choice for the poor to work on their behalf. Every careful survey across boundaries of time and space shows us that the poor are sicker than the non-poor. Given this indisputable association, medicine has a clear, if not always observed, mandate to devote itself to populations struggling against poverty. He then moves to critique traditional global health ethics that tends to, 1, neglect the ways that poverty profoundly influences health outcomes, and 2, tends to blame those who are impoverished for their illness and destitution. A great example of this is found with non-compliant tuberculosis patients in Haiti who are so impoverished that they cannot even take their medications nor even get to the offices to get treatment. Farmer suggests that an alternative approach, one of pragmatic solidarity, where he says one makes common cause with those in need, with that sentiment accompanied by goods and services that might diminish unjust hardship. Next slide. This leads to the ethical and practical normative framework of accompaniment. Accompaniment is used time and time again to frame Partners in Health, the NGO found by Paul Farmer and others, their mission to bring the best possible care to impoverished and marginalized patients all over the world. In a commencement address titled Accompaniment as Policy, Farmer states, next slide, accompaniment is an elastic term. It has a basic everyday meaning. To accompany someone is to go somewhere with him or her, to break bread together, to be present on a journey with a beginning and an end. There's an element of mystery or of openness, of trust in accompaniment. The companion, the accompagnateur, my French is very bad, forgive me, says, I'll go with you and support you on your journey wherever it leads. I'll share your faith for a while. And by a while, I don't mean a little while. Accompaniment is about sticking with the task until it's deemed completed, not by the accompagnateur, but by the person being accompanied. There's a profound mutuality and even risk involved in accompaniment. In it, the one seeking to accompany the other and the one being accompanied are in lockstep. They are on the road together. There is skin in the game, as it were, for both parties. The one seeking to accompany the other puts themselves at the service and under the direction of the accompanied. The work is finished when the accompanied person or community says that it is done. There's a familiar proximity and care and even friendship at the heart of this approach. Next slide. Further, an accompaniment approach entails an epistemological shift. That is, an effort to change where knowledge is obtained due to a recognition that knowledge and theories are particular to specific circumstances and specific communities. Next slide. In the words of bioethicists M. Therese Lysott and Michael McCarthy, next slide, this epistemological shift moves our ethical locus or starting point to those people who are oppressed. Such a shift demands more than simply inviting these people to the table. Rather, it makes a radical commitment to move the table to them or to go to their tables to listen, as called for in Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Drawing near to and choosing to privilege and trust the voices of those who are oppressed is a way of resisting power differentials that undergird the root causes of oppression and thus are necessary commitments in working for truly liberating justice. This liberating work has been proven to not only improve outcomes, but also invites practitioners to consider that accompaniment of the sick facilitates communion and connection with patients and communities. It is an ethical way of life that is fulfilling and blurs the boundaries that are often drawn between the professional and the personal lives of healthcare practitioners. It is a whole life ethic, one that requires proximity and the elimination of what Roberto Goizueta characterizes as safe enclosures, as well as the reordering of our institutions. Next slide. This leads me to a very brief reflection on how accompaniment is important for the practice of medicine, as well as the ordering of healthcare institutions. As I am an aspiring surgeon, I will link this to the practice of surgery and the case of a surgical patient I cared for while on my clinical rotations. Next slide. A 26-year-old Black man named Samuel with a history of prior gunshot wound from an impoverished part of the city presented to the trauma bay after sustaining multiple gunshot wounds. He underwent emergent surgery requiring placement of a chest tube for hemodynamic instability, repair of multiple small bowel injuries, a rectal injury, a femur fracture, bladder laceration, and more. Prompt and thorough surgical intervention saved his life. By the time I met him while working on the trauma surgery service as a medical student, he had been hospitalized in total for well over 100 days. The sequelae of his injuries were staggering. He had multiple enterocutaneous fistulae and was completely bedridden with an external fixation for his femur fracture repair. This was a truly devastating case of an injury that totally changed the life of this previously healthy young man, a man only 1 month younger than me. I sometimes check in on him to this day. He is still struggling to walk and simply make it in the world. Conventional medical and surgical ethics as disciplines might engage with the various procedures that Samuel underwent and grapple with the nature of consent and the decision-making underlying the myriad interventions we put him through. It could also speak to the ways that our care might have also exacerbated harm. There were instances of iatrogenic injury, for example, and challenge the team towards transparency and error reporting. I won't spend too much time on this case, as I know my colleagues, Drs. Lyon and Block, will spend more time grappling with what accompaniment might look like in practice. Next slide. I will close with 4 implications an accompaniment approach brings to bear in the care of patients like Samuel and their communities. And just to be clear, this is just a start. There's so much more to be said. Next slide. First, we ought to embrace an epistemological shift that moves our ethical locus or starting point to those who are oppressed. This requires taking time to slow down and to listen to communities and the individual patients we care for, requiring a cadence that resists the harried pace that characterizes modern medicine. If the voices of the communities affected by the worst of disease are not considered, our ethical pursuits have failed. A meaningful response to patients like Samuel, a young Black man hailing from a community that is disproportionately affected by gun violence, might look like a hospital-based violence intervention program or partnering with community-based restorative justice initiatives, as is the case in my home city of Durham, North Carolina. As healthcare practitioners, next slide. As healthcare practitioners, we must also challenge the historical silence of the field of bioethics around the private sphere. Accompaniment calls for those who are seeking to respond ethically to their patients to become proximate to them, resisting the urge to retreat to a safe enclosure at a controllable, economically distant geographical space. This influences how one spends their money, distributes their time and resources, and even where they might choose to live. This case challenges clinicians to consider what it might look like to become proximate to Samuel's community. Moving into the neighborhood is not out of the question, even if that entails risk. Next slide. 3, we ought to meaningfully recognize and address the roles that racism, poverty, and other forms of structural violence play in driving disease and disparities, and work in solidarity to resist these realities for the sake of patients' health. These challenges demand one to consider their role as advocates. It also places a priority on research and clinical practices that work towards addressing the root causes of increased morbidity and mortality. Next slide. Hospitals and healthcare systems must center voices and representation from the communities they serve. They should resist prioritizing the bottom line, financial success, and RVUs when measuring outcomes. They should create space for practitioners to slow down and become proximate to patients, both in and outside the hospital, and incentivize community-based research and initiatives that facilitate meaningful friendships and relationships between practitioners, patients, and communities. These initial reflections are intentionally open to variation and creativity. They have both local and global implications. 4, accompaniment on an individual and institutional level is dynamic and ever-changing, as it is spent in step with and driven by the individuals and communities that are accompanied. Accompaniment is inherently contextual, yet deeply concerned with rooting itself in the lived experiences of marginalized communities that suffer the most from injustice, and thereby universally bear a disproportionate burden of disease. It invites clinicians and other healthcare practitioners to reconsider their relationship to patients and the communities they serve, minimizing the clinician-patient power gap and creating the space to break bread together in a mutual pursuit of health, justice, and equity. In this talk, I've offered an introduction to accompaniment as a concept and given some initial thoughts on important implications of accompaniment in the practice of medicine and in healthcare institutions. I'll now hand it over to Dr. Peter Casarella, who will dive deeper into the theological and ethical dimensions of accompaniment. Next slide is my sources, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Phifer, for your presentation. Next, we have Dr. Peter Casarella, who has been professor at Duke Divinity School since 2020. Before Duke, he taught at Notre Dame and was the founding director of the Paul Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology. He has published a monograph, Word as Bread, Language and Theology in Nicolas of Cusa, and co-edited the following collections: Cuerpo de Cristo, the Hispanic Presence in the U.S. Catholic Church, Finding Beauty in the Other, Theological Reflections Across Religious Traditions, The Whole is Greater Than Its Parts, Ecumenism and Interreligious Encounters in the Age of Pope Francis, and Pope Francis and the Search for God in America, and the significance of his early visits to the Americas. His current project is the publication of a series of books, starting with The God of the People, a Latinx Theology, and The Spirit of the People, a Latinx Ecumenical Global Pneumatology. Thank you, Dr. Peter Casarella, for joining us. The time is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me here and for that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the Center for Christian Bioethics and the Center for Whole Person Care at Loma Linda for organizing this event. So I'm not a practitioner, I'm a theologian, and my focus is on the what more rather than the how of accompaniment. But these reflections, which I'll briefly offer, are also the fruit of a company, of a group that we formed here at Duke Divinity, which we like to call Theology en la Clínica. So I don't know if that's the ultimate testing ground of these ideas, but it's certainly been the furnace out of which they've been forged. So I'll just focus on some of the things that Phifer was already discussing, starting with lo cotidiano, the everyday experience, saying a little bit more about proximity, a little bit more about liberation, and ending with the theme of la familia. So why is lo cotidiano, or the everyday, important? Starting with Ada Maria Isasidia's groundbreaking work, En la Lucha, Latinx theologians have begun to examine the task of enculturation from within the practice of everyday life. And I think one of the important points here, and I'm not going to go into it in depth, is that the specific application of lo cotidiano, or looking at the world from the perspective of the everyday, intersects with social medicine in terms of what Ivan Illich calls, and Phifer had referred to this in terms of the individual case, but Illich actually talked about cultural iatrogenesis. And so this model of the everyday here, which I'm going to briefly lay out from Isasidias, is meant to overcome the kind of technocratic paradigm, or what some even call the Baconian paradigm, whereby the person offering clinical wisdom is dissecting the reality in front of her or him. So medicine deals with patients who live in everyday situations of struggle, like disruptive families and competing multiple employers. Medicine cannot fruitfully fulfill its aims as a discipline if the patient is just seen as an isolated statistic that confirms the social demographic from which the patient putatively hails. Every patient has been subjected to well-meaning social analysis, but nobody in the final analysis deserves to be treated as just a number. The illusion of a wealth of demographic identifiers can also be a screen for hiding vital relationships. The attentive diagnostician needs to see the whole picture, in other words, the whole cultural linguistic system with all of its internal polarities and agonistic relationships. And just briefly, Isasidias went into great length about these agonistic relationships as a mujerista theologian and even as a Cuban-American theologian, looking at her own situatedness in terms of what she remembers from the Havana she's from and what she experiences struggling with women in the United States today. So that's a little bit about the theory of the context out of which Theology en la Clínica can take place. Now to the point of proximity, which Phifer already acknowledged. Proximity was noted as a key category in patient care by participants in Duke Divinity's Theology en la Clínica. Proximity speaks to the possibilities inherent in applying Latinx personalism to patient care. There are explicitly religious roots for thinking about proximity as an ethical category, such as the hospitality laws of ancient Israel, which are echoed in the Quran, as well as the well-known parable of the Good Samaritan, an image in the Gospel of Luke and elsewhere in the New Testament of a banquet feast of social equity. The Latinx medical perspective on the ethics of proximity is well articulated by the Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas in his magnum opus Otherwise Than Being. Levinas writes about the face-to-face encounter with the stranger with a form of discernment that is almost clinical. Levinas knows that modern scientism turns the space of the encounter into a neutral Baconian grid of calculable coordinates with no ethical obligations whatsoever. The way out of this prison of merely instrumental proximity is not a disembodied mandate like a categorical imperative, Kant's solution, but rather a moral recognition of the incessant and corporeal human restlessness that's found in everyday life. Proximity can become fraternity or indifference, depending on how we configure that space of encounter as a space of meaning, or what Levinas terms signifyingness. The normal human reaction, think here of a caregiver meeting a new patient, is to look in the mirror when we look at a stranger in the face. For Levinas, the ethics of proximity goes in the opposite direction of mirroring. And this is a quote: "The mode in which a face indicates its own absence undoes the approach. The mode in which a face indicates its own absence of my responsibility requires a description that can be formed only in ethical language." End of quote. In plainer English, the otherness of the patient becomes a challenge for the caregiver not to impose his or her own face onto the face of the other. The ontological disparity between my desire to see my own face and the other and the actual alterity that comes to fore in the encounter with the other is so great that Levinas sees here an entrance for the passing of a trace of the absolute. Transcendence comes into view only where there is a complete disavowal of mirror-like self-reflection. The ethical demands then become startlingly simple and necessarily apodictic. Thou shalt not kill. That seems like a low bar, until one reflects upon how that bar was not met by the Nazis who killed the fellow Jews in Levinas's Eastern European family. In sum, the doctor must unlearn the identity of the patient in order to see the good of that patient. Recognition of Latinx identity should be seen as a struggle and the encounter with an absence in oneself. It's not fulfilled through a simple gesture of clinical reserve, pious charity, or outright pity. Now, where does liberation come to play in all this? One thing that Levinas offers us here is a not merely epistemological, but also an ontological and trans-ontological or ethical way of looking at our situatedness in the doctor-patient relationship. And of course, what has already been said by Phifer very eloquently about the witnesses, the joint witnesses of Gustavo Gutierrez, Paul Farmer, and others, directly applies to what I'm now about to reflect upon. A healthcare giver who communicates a vision of the person in and outside of the clinic can free bodies from illness in both individual and social cases. The personal and social freedom promised by social medicine can thus be considered as the dialect of an integral theology of liberation because of a convergence of terms, concepts, and aims. The late and highly venerable Paul Farmer and the Peruvian theologian Gustavo Gutierrez have produced a collaborative publication on that theme. The main form of proximity here is the act of accompaniment that involves the sharing of bread and involves systemic advocacy for God's preferential action for the poor. Bread here signifies nutrition, medicine, and a cultural balm. The sacrament of the anointing of the sick is one example of the sharing of bread, whether or not it includes a distribution of a consecrated host. Accompaniment goes beyond a quick fix and temporary insertion. It studies the disconnects in linguistic, cultural, and religious translation, as well as the good practices that promote communication, transparency, and therefore allow for a sustainable global health in the community. In this view, social medicine and liberation theology are both dialects of the same language of global health, a language that itself crosses and binds theology and medicine. Liberation theology cannot serve the poor without sustainable practices of life-giving healthcare. Global health cannot treat the problems of marginalized communities if the patients are just seen as isolated and discrete case studies for future research. Both global healthcare and a liberation is key, and liberation theology within the field of health partnerships are, in the language of Levinas, enunciative practices that speak to presences and absences of solidarity and the establishment of a new intercultural human family. That gets me to the last point about familia. Familia in a Latinx idiom, a Latinx theological idiom, is not just the biological family, and by all means, it's not just the nuclear family. It starts with the abuelita de la abuelita. It starts with looking at your own genealogy and the cultural matrix that brought you to the place where you find yourself now. So the caregiver who inserts herself or himself into a new cultural context, different from the one that she or he started with, has to learn not just the story of the individual patient in front of her or him, but this whole genealogy behind it. The concept of la familia and the concomitant goal of interprofessional cooperation in the service of treating the whole person can both play a pivotal role in Latinx social medicine. In Latinx theology, la familia has both a descriptive and a normative role. It describes the reality of the family beyond the nuclear family and the complex interlacing network of support from parents, cousins, grandparents, godparents, and many others that is palpably felt in the community. The negative side is especially apparent to women when there are ingrained patterns of patriarchy, machismo, and diminished hopes for young women in the public life, STEM careers, and self-advancement. Normatively, the model of La Familia has been implied by social ethicists such as Victor Carmona and Nicole Flores to apply a call for comprehensive immigration reform and also more attention being paid to families in which some members have proper documentation for residency in the United States and others do not. The model of La Familia applies to Latinx social medicine in a variety of ways. One participant in Teología en la Clínica reported that the whole healthcare team needs to model itself along the lines of La Familia. The model can also confirm or facilitate conversation about best practices when they are being pursued in a variety of fields. And in fact, let me just conclude by mentioning something that came out in one of the previous sessions that some of us were involved in, where our colleague, Adam Rene Rosenbaum, talked about, who had been studying liberation since the time he was in college before he went into medicine, talked about how he went into the local school in order to get to know the culture of the school. And Alex speaks Spanish and everything. He doesn't have any problem with translation on the literal level, but he wanted to understand the culture of the local school in order to be a better pediatrician in the clinic. And I thought that was very interesting and relevant. So let me just summarize. I've tried to say a little bit about lo cotidiano, about proximity, about social liberation, and the ethics of la familia. These are just some offerings for those of you who are in the practice of social medicine, and I leave it to your clinical experience to make more prudential judgments that might arise out of these reflections. In a sense, all I've done is offer you a kind of Aristotelian scopus, something that you can aim at, but you have to use your own clinical and prudential judgments to figure out how to actually fire the arrow. So in sum, I think what we're talking about here is a way of being near within the everyday experience of marginalized patients in order to bring an end to oppression and a palpable sense of belonging together, a palpable sense of familia, that to the degree that it is feasible and in service of the common good, that goes beyond a divide between doctor and patient. Thank you very much for your attention. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much, Dr. Casarella, for your presentation. Our next presenter, Dr. Alex Lyon, is Medical Director of Pediatric Neuro-Oncology at Riley Hospital for Children. His research focuses on the integration of patient religion and spirituality into their care. He has co-authored several publications in this area, including ethics publications on physician prayer and how to address parents praying for a miracle, a review of chaplain notes with insights, how to integrate chaplain care into medical practice, as well as a pilot study of interprofessional spiritual care in pediatric hematology oncology. Dr. Lyon currently holds a grant to provide team-based spiritual care training across the IU health system. Dr. Lyon is the co-director of the Religion and Spirituality in Medicine Scholarly Concentration at the IU School of Medicine. He's also the associate director of the Evans Center for the Integration of Spiritual and Religious Values at IU Health, in which he hosts a quarterly spirituality research colloquium. On the national level, Dr. Lyon sits on the Executive Leadership Committee for the Conference on Medicine and Religion. Welcome, Dr. Lyon.
Thank you so much. And it is such a joy for me to be in this virtual conference with you all. Since Loma Linda is where I did my pediatric residency. And as I speak about accompaniment, I'm going to get to share a few stories from Mi Familia after leaving California and coming to Indiana. And also in the spirit of accompaniment, I also want to say that, a disclaimer, I'm not a theologian, and that I really love that I got to learn so much about the theology of accompaniment from a medical student, from Phifer Nicholson. So thank you for that. When I think about the word accompaniment, I think about mi abuelita, Trinidad Segovia, who emigrated from Mexico to the US via Texas. And I think about her faith in the one who accompanied them in their journey, so that as she passed from Texas to Arizona on the way to California, she gave birth to my mother and named her Manuela, which is translated God with us. So my family is the first evidence of a higher accompaniment with me. But why does he accompany the poor? As I read Father Gustavo Gutierrez, and in particular his book on Job, God Talk and the Suffering of the Innocent, I read that God does not choose to give attention to the poor because of any qualifications. Much different than what it took for me to get into medical school, to pass the board exams, or to become the medical director of pediatric neuro-oncology. Those abilities and achievements that this world considers so important, they are not so much all that in the eyes of God. Just as Dr. Casarella spoke about unlearning the patient, perhaps I also need to unlearn myself and to unlearn what it means to be a physician. As Gutierrez quotes Luke 6:20, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." In addition, Luke 18:25 says it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. And we often think about our riches as financial wealth, and that is one way for there to be a power differential in medicine. However, in medicine, it is possible our riches, which can hold us back from seeing the poor clearly, even more so is the wealth of our mind, our intellectual obtainment. So perhaps this first contemplation, acknowledging the extent to which I have seen myself in the light of my abilities, and to recognize the love of God is truly gratuitous, is a first step for me to accompany others. So accompany entails humility in medicine, and to recognize the patient brings strengths and ways of being healed, which are sometimes invisible to the powers of medicine. They sometimes bring a response to suffering beyond what reason alone would understand. One of my first patients in pediatric oncology was a young man with Hodgkin lymphoma, whose story he consented for me to share in the ethics newsletter for the American Academy of Pediatrics. Now, Hodgkin lymphoma is one of the most curable cancers in children. The boy's father, however, was almost inconsolable at the time of breaking the bad news. The nurses who had done the intake came into our workroom, and they too were crying. The boy's mother was at home, dying of breast cancer. I went in to see the boy and his father, and I saw the father's shirt, which had a picture and words referencing a pastor's conference he had been to. As we got to know each other more, I learned that the father valued prayer. And so there were times when, after getting labs, getting chemotherapy, the family and I would pray together. And at one point, the father told me, speaking about that distress, it's not about the cancer. The cancer I can handle, but it's this feeling like God has abandoned me. And over time, as we took time to pray together, to walk together, he told me in time that there was a point where he felt like he was not alone and that God had not abandoned him. As a pediatric neuro-oncologist reading Gustavo Gutierrez on the book of Job, I find Accompaniment theology provides me with a framework to grasp and hold the love of God and the suffering of the innocent. And the ability to hold these two things, I believe, is a secret to not becoming jaded in medicine. He writes, there is, in fact, no circumstance of human life that makes it more difficult to accept the gratuitous love of God than our own experience of suffering, especially if the suffering be unjust. Anyone who has taken care of children with severe and life-threatening medical problems eventually meets families who ask the questions, why? Or even, why would God do something like this? Is God punishing me? A theology of accompaniment is quite the opposite of a theology of retribution. With the theology of retribution, the friends of Job try to rationalize why God is suffering unjustly. He must have done something wrong. Quite the opposite. A theology of accompaniment acknowledges that there are injustices in the world and answers the question, where is God in all of this, with a calling? God is present and is calling us to see the unjust suffering of the innocent and to go accompany them. Accompany entails a preferential calling to the poor. Now, Paul Farmer's application of accompaniment involved global mission and community health. And what a beautiful application that has been. But what if my practice is not positioned to venture overseas? What if I have been called to enter a medical specialty and even subspecialty, which places me in an academic hospital hours away from some of the poorest patients who seek care at my healthcare center? Is it possible to demonstrate accompaniment in the midst of the American healthcare system in the model which was not founded on the theology of accompaniment? I believe it is. In whatever community clinic or in whatever specialty you are led into, it is possible to ask ourselves, who are the poor in my area of healthcare? How can I place myself in proximity with them? And what is the transformation, even within the current healthcare model in America, which can happen when I walk in solidarity with them? In common pediatric oncology practice in the United States, the poor include populations which are underrepresented in clinical trial enrollment and in genomic studies. These include Latinx communities, as well as African American families, and in genomic studies, they also include Asian families. One of my chaplain partners tells me we can only move at the speed of trust. And from multiple states in the country, I have seen patients who struggle to trust the medical system. And I have seen the end result of this struggle when the patients come to me with a diagnosis of brain cancer, sometimes only after a delay in receiving care. How does this happen? An ophthalmologist does not believe the young African American who says they have blurred vision in an eye. A Black mother goes to the ER several times before insisting a head CT is obtained for her child's symptoms. A child is diagnosed with failure to thrive, and a mother is told she is not doing her job to feed the child. She is not feeding him enough. She is not mixing the formula correctly. She is neglecting her child. These are a few of the examples of the poor I have seen whose children had delays in diagnosis of a brain tumor. So my job as a pediatric neuro-oncologist becomes harder unless the frontline workers in community pediatrics, the emergency room, and other community specialists are given the vision to accompany the poor. Accompaniment entails a prophetic vision which places us in pragmatic solidarity with the poor. And for me, this prophetic vision has come from my experience with my family. So the last thing some of the colleagues at Loma Linda heard from me, I had left Loma Linda. My wife, Gianna, and I brought our son, Samuel, to go to Indiana for my pediatric hematology oncology fellowship. And 2 years later, we adopted 2 children, Jordan and Kinsley, Black children. Kinsley came with a packet of medical notes from a prestigious medical system in a different state. At 2.5 years old, she had already had a previous episode of acute liver failure and a hospitalization for the diagnosis of failure to thrive. I've already told you to beware of the diagnosis of failure to thrive, especially because it can have attached to it a differential diagnosis of neglect by parents. And I think the diagnosis of neglect is susceptible sometimes to inherent bias. We began to suspect that something was wrong when Kinsley came home and she had daily loose stools. The pediatrician didn't think much of it. And in the 4th month she was home with us, she began to run a fever. And before we knew it, she was in the PICU in septic shock. First on the ventilator and then on the mechanical oscillator. She coded and was resuscitated on the 7th of 21 days in the ICU. Her swab for a respiratory viral panel was positive for several viruses, and her blood culture grew several different bacteria. How could this be? Several specialists were called to consult, including ones from my own department in pediatric hematology oncology. When nothing was panning out, I asked the PICU attending to talk to my colleague to run a whole exome sequence, a test that would sequence every gene expressed from her DNA. The ICU attending listened to me as a colleague who was trustworthy, and they ran the test. The result was we learned she had Shwachman-Diamond syndrome, a genetic condition which could lead to periodic dips in the immune system and increased susceptibility to cancer, and also lack of pancreatic enzymes to absorb fat. And when you do not have the pancreatic enzymes to absorb fat, you do not gain weight and you receive the diagnosis of failure to thrive. My daughter amazingly recovered and was called the miracle girl when we took her home from the hospital. But another miracle to me was the opening of my eyes to see. This is what it took for a child born to a marginalized family to be diagnosed and treated well. It is also a miracle of proximity to now look at other children and overlay their face with that of my daughters. It has given me a greater ability to listen to parents and to treat them as I would a respected colleague in the field. I'll conclude my comments for now by saying that accompaniment gives us a moral vision to counter structures of power and even see the extent to which we have participated in this system of injustice. I'll share just a brief story that I think is prophetic, watching my sons, Jordan and Samuel, who had a hard time learning to be good brothers at first. They would fight and nearly injure each other over Thomas the Train toys. And it eventually came time to watch our first Super Bowl together on the TV. And my wife, Gianna, had made nachos. Samuel was eating the nachos too fast and he began to choke on one. He turned red and started to cough. Before I could get to him to perform the Heimlich maneuver, he vomited the nacho up, clearing the obstruction. And after I went to help him, he settled down and I looked over and saw Jordan crying. And I saw him and asked him what was wrong. And he told me, I don't want my brother to hurt. I was invited to speak in an ethics of philanthropy class recently and led a discussion on spirituality and philanthropy. We read and discussed the earliest Hebrew story on gift giving, which ironically is also the earliest story of injustice within that tradition, the story of Cain and Abel. And as we know from the story, Abel brings an acceptable gift and Cain kills his brother. I asked the students, how could we rewrite the story today for it to turn out differently? One student said the story could be rewritten even after the act of violence was committed. If only Cain had answered his own question and said, yes, I am my brother's keeper. Or as my son Jordan said, I don't want my brother to hurt. For me, accompanying the poor in my practice means seeing them as I would my own daughter or as my brother. It is an attitude, a practice, and is humbling to accompany others as we were first accompanied, just as in the name of my mother, Manuela, says, God is with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lyon. Next, we have Dr. Jenny Block. Dr. Jenny Weiss Block is a Dominican laywoman and a practical theologian, and currently serves as Senior Advisor on Health and Policy at Partners in Health. From 2009 through 2020, she served as Chief Advisor to Dr. Paul Farmer and was his Chief of Staff in his role as United Nations Deputy Special Envoy under President Bill Clinton. She currently has oversight for the Science of Implementation Initiative, where she focuses on policy and advocacy in international aid effectiveness aimed at improving life for the billion poorest people in the world. Her projects include advocating for the implementation of an accompaniment model in aid delivery, which redirects resource allocation to local governments and the poor, and tracking data on aid delivery and resulting outcomes. She's a co-editor of In the Company of the Poor, Conversations with Dr. Paul Farmer and Father Gustavo Gutierrez. And her recent book, Paul Farmer, Servant to the Poor, won a Catholic Press Association Award. Dr. Block lives in Miami and New York. She has 3 fine children and 4 adorable grandchildren. Thank you so much, Dr. Block, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I want to begin by thanking my friends at Loma Linda for including me today. I'm very honored to join the members of this panel and very grateful for their thoughtful insights on this important and compelling topic. As you may know, Father Jim Keenan, a Jesuit priest and one of the leading moral theologians of our time, coined the title phrase of today's Grand Rounds. In his book, The Works of Mercy, Father Jim defines mercy as the willingness to enter into the chaos of another person's life. I have found this to be an apt description, for anyone who takes the practice of accompaniment seriously will surely be called to show mercy to others, and in the doing, find mercy for themselves. And as Father Jim well knows, mercy almost always entails entering into the unknown and almost always complicated and messy chaos of another person's life. I am not a clinician, just a pretty humble practical theologian, although I did work for Paul Farmer for many years, and has been noted, Paul was both an experienced and dedicated physician who, in my opinion, and the opinion of many others, set the standard for the practice of accompaniment in healthcare. So I guess it's fair to say I studied at the feet of a master. My remarks today are simple. They focus on the practical and spiritual dimensions of accompaniment. And in my short presentation, I'm going to begin by presenting a working definition of accompaniment for your consideration, an overview of what I believe are the key characteristics that ground the ethics and practice of accompaniment. Next, I'll offer a few suggestions about what I believe are the hallmarks of a good accompaniteur, followed by some short closing remarks. I'd hoped to tell an accompaniment story, but I don't think I'll have enough time to do so. So, what is a good working definition of this broad and elastic term of accompaniment? I'd like to propose that a helpful way to understand what accompaniment is to see it as a spiritual practice. For the contours of accompaniment are inherently spiritual in nature, and accompaniment links our interior desire for communion with others to an outward expression in human relationships. Let me explain why I believe accompaniment is a spiritual practice in a little more detail. By its very nature, spiritual practices are meant to discipline the practitioner, to call him or her to ongoing conversion of heart, which opens him or her to the larger reality beyond the narrowness of self-involvement. Active participation and faithfulness to a genuine spiritual practice develops our interior life, calling us inward to reflect and outward to serve others. Committing to consistently following any spiritual practice is most often rugged terrain, a lot of stops and starts, sometimes counterintuitive, and at some point or another, one will be asked to lay aside our modes of self-protection, reject self-interest, and make some very inconvenient choices and decisions. In my personal experience and observation of others, this description of spiritual practice also well describes the process and what is required of those who seriously undertake the practice of accompaniment. While this is far from a comprehensive list, here is what I would name as some of the key characteristics of the spiritual practice of accompaniment. Number one, accompaniment does not happen by accident. The decision to be an accompaniteur in its fullest sense is a highly intentional act that takes practice, requires dedication, and vigilance. Number two, accompaniment is never an abstraction. The primary locus of accompaniment, as we've heard, is proximate. It's always in the human and personal dimension and focuses on real people in concrete situations in their own specific historical and cultural realities. Number three, accompaniment is organized even in institutional settings or when there are contractual arrangements present, which was often common in our work, around long-term relationships, commitments, open-ended listening, and walking with rather than taking the lead. As anyone who's tried to do this, especially people with a lot of personal agency, this is not as easy as it seems. Like all spiritual practices, when practiced wisely and consistently, accompaniment offers access to the transcendent and provides a clear guide for living a moral life that is rich with meaning, and in turn deepens one's faith in God and in humanity. Number five, accompanying the lonely other is most often not about heroic activity, but rather about laying down one's life in little pieces of sacrificial love and service. Number six, and finally, when one willingly enters into the chaos of another person's life, there is simply no way you can avoid, at one time or another, having your heart broken out of love. So what makes somebody a good accompaniteur? This is far from a comprehensive list also, but I'd like to spend a few minutes describing the traits and qualities good accompagnateurs have in common, many of which are based on my observations of the way in which Paul Farmer and others that I admire practice the art, and it is an art, of accompaniment. Number one, good accompagnateurs practice many modes of generosity and hospitality with their time and personal resources, and make compassion, patience, and forgiveness their default reaction. Paul calls this a hermeneutic of generosity. Number two, everything good accompagnateurs say and do communicates, I am with you and for you, and you can count on me. Even when the need to challenge or offer well-intended and well-meaning criticism is necessary. This is done in the gentlest possible way, with every effort to understand the context and what support is needed to resolve a problem. Number 3, good accompagnators are committed to what Paul and I like to call the ministry of showing up. Even when physical presence is impossible, there are many ways to show up and communicate support, especially given modern technology. I was always amazed by the number of people the world over that Paul communicated with daily on his WhatsApp account. He liked this method because it was free to poor people around the world, and often there was a request for money or medical care or to share their pain and hardship to a compassionate presence. All 3 tried and true modes of accompaniment. Number 4, good accompagnators practice what Paul Farmer calls cultural humility, realizing we can never fully understand a culture or an experience different than our own. Believing we do fully understand another's reality, especially in settings of impoverishment for which we have no frame of reference, can lead to make erroneous assumptions, which can inadvertently present as arrogant and patronizing. I believe the story Dr. Lyon told very well is a very good example of exactly what we're talking about. Number 5, good accompagnators listen carefully and keenly with the ears of the heart, hearing what is both said and left unsaid, and preferring always a compassionate and generous response. Number 6, and again, Dr. Lyon, I think you well described this. Good accompagnators are very careful with what Paul refers to as quick or confident claims of causality. By this, he means refraining from making quick judgments and drawing conclusions about the reasons for behaviors and outcomes in complex situations with too much certainty and self-confidence. Much of the time, probably most of the time, after more in-depth inquiry and after listening and observing a situation with careful attention, we often realize that we cannot lay claims to what we thought we knew for sure. The inherent danger in making incorrect claims of causality is that these claims are often used for making strategic decisions and that chart a course of action, which is ultimately incorrect and can have devastating outcomes, especially for poor people. Number 7, good accompagnators form relationships based on equality and respect, allowing the poor and oppressed to be their teachers and guides. In situations where there's an imbalance of power and resources, good accompagnators are on guard to avoid patronizing attitudes and behaviors, remembering always that accompaniment is not a one-way street where the haves help the have-nots, the rich are generous to the poor, the learned teach the ignorance, the powerful bend down to the powerless, and the more gifted evangelize the less endowed. Number 8, good accompagnators are realistic about their own limitations and acknowledge their own need for accompaniment and take time for serious reflection, both in silence and with trusted partners, and accept the fact that everyone needs to make their time for rest and renewal. Number 8, good accompagnators develop the ability to take the long view, putting hardship in perspective and accepting the setbacks, disappointments, and failures that are all part of the reality of accompaniment. And finally, good accompagnators are humble and focus on giving hope to others. They somehow, perhaps not always explicitly, learn to depend on the grace of God, which passes all understanding. And thus, while they take the task at hand very seriously, they do not see themselves as overly important or significant. People often ask or remark on how cheerful and hopeful Paul was, especially in the face of encountering so much suffering. I believe the source of his hope was his trust in God's love and God's promises. And his cheerfulness spoke of a humility that lacks self-importance because he was faithfully responding to what God had called him to in his own time and place. So yes, Dr. Lyons, I think wherever you are is where you're called to be and to practice accompaniment in your own time and place. I invite each of the panelists today and anyone watching to develop their own list of traits and qualities of a good accompanitor. I'd love it if you sent them to me and we could have a longer conversation about these traits. We're in the process of talking about a book on accompaniment now. And, to share with people and all those who are willing to enter into the chaos of another person's life. In closing, I'd like to leave you with two final thoughts. First, I hope I have not painted an overly romantic picture or misrepresented the realities of accompaniment. The practice of accompaniment is not for the faint-hearted. It's hard and it can be extremely demanding, often quite inconvenient, and often it requires a financial component. It sometimes involves the crossing of boundaries, and at times asks us to dig deep to come up with resources we didn't know we had. And much of the time, we feel like we've fallen short. And of course, there is a sadness that a heart broken out of love brings with it. My second and related point is that at the same time, in spite of, or as a spiritual director I used to have would say, because of, all the inevitable hardships, there is a paradoxical spirituality embedded in the spiritual practice of accompaniment that offers an endless stream of gifts which give meaning to our lives like nothing else can. This paradoxical spirituality embedded in accompaniment brings us face to face with our own limitations and exposes our false ideas about what really matters. In some real sense, long-term accompaniment must be a spiritual practice. Otherwise, the temptation to despair would be too great. Instead, accompanying the lonely other allows us to witness suffering without losing hope. At times, the massive suffering we will see will break our hearts and bring us to our knees. But in turn, in some mysterious way, we are led by the grace of God into a deeper reality that allows us to be truly compassionate and to be able to move forward and to make the choice to love instead of hate, to hope instead of despair. Accompaniment spirituality unites us with our brothers and sisters side by side, heart to heart. It impels us to keep working for justice and peace and to dispense the medicine of mercy, however humble what we have to give may be. It all comes, of course, at great price, but to choose otherwise would be turning our backs on the opportunity to live in holy communion with our brothers and sisters. And for this and for the opportunity to serve and to enter into the chaos of another person's life, we give God praise and thanks. As I said, I'm very happy to be here today, and thank you so much for including me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Block. Before I turn to Dr. Saul Barcelo for the response, I just want to encourage everyone who is participating virtually with us to think of questions that you might want to ask the panelists, and we will have a couple of minutes at the end of our webinar for a Q&A session. And also want to say an apology to those who are outside of the Loma Linda University network who are trying to log on to this webinar. Apparently, we've been experiencing, I've received a number of inquiries from people who are unable to log on, and I was just made aware by our tech team that unless you have an LLU address, you won't be able to log on to this webinar. It is something that we tried to correct, but unsuccessfully. But rest assured, everything that we did today is recorded, and we will shortly make all of this available on our YouTube channel as well as on our website for everybody to view. So again, want to apologize for those of you who had a lot of difficulties logging on, but you will be able to watch this retrospectively later on. So Dr. Saul Barcelo will now be responding to the panelists and your excellent presentations. Dr. Barcelo was born and raised in Mexico. He migrated to the United States to continue his education. This early experience of being uprooted from familiar spaces allowed him to understand what it means to be in between spaces, and at the same time helped him develop a border thinking that is reflected in his current work as a pastor, chaplain, professor, and scholar. Dr. Saul Barcelo is the director of the Center for Whole Person Care, the center that is co-sponsoring this event, and an assistant professor at the School of Religion at Loma Linda University. His research interests include topics of spirituality in healthcare, healthcare chaplaincy, ethics, at the intersection of race and religion in society, theologies of liberation and Latinx identities, and spirituality. His education includes a master's degree in clinical ministries from Loma Linda University, as well as a master's degree and a PhD in religion, ethics, and politics from Claremont School of Theology. Dr. Barcelo, thank you so much.
First of all, I'm grateful that I can be listening to these presentations in the front row. I'm inspired to go out here and think of the concept of accompaniment, especially for our community in Loma Linda University Health. Medical accompaniment, we are reminded, requires a cultural and a spiritual approach. These two components were highlighted by our presenters. First, let me focus on the cultural commitment. Dr. Casarella invited us to think and look a lo cotidiano, the daily. Sometimes during the daily struggles in our own practice, in our own responsibilities, it's easy to find meaning and purpose. Dr. Casarella says that medicine deals with patients who live in everyday situations of struggles. To be an accompaniator in a cultural setting, we are required to see not just what's happening to the patient, but also what are the social forces that are impacting the patient and perhaps contributing to the illness, to the disease. Accompaniment requires, again, to address these cultural influences, to speak on it, and sometimes to act and resist these forces. In regards to these cultural commitments, we are reminded that at this point, the best solution to address the needs of those who are struggling, the marginalized, the poor, we must come close to them. Close with the other, it's not easy, as we just heard the closing remarks of Dr. Blog. It's not an easy task. It's a long-term commitment. But when it comes to proximity, we are perhaps reminded of, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, how Yahweh committed from the very beginning of the journey in the desert to his people, all the way to the end. Proximity also is shown in the Gospels when John describes the Word became flesh. And using a paraphrased version, it says, and he moved into the neighborhood. Jesus pitched a tent and became one. Proximity, closest with other. It's an action that requires that we act and do something about it. Perhaps in the medical profession, this is difficult because we tend to specialize, right? We tend to refer, I am done with my commitment with you, now you go with somebody else. Sometimes we are required to unlearn. Phifer invited us to shift, to create epistemological shift, where we are beginning to see that it's not just that I am done within my specialty, I must now engage others. And to this, Dr. Casarella says, it's maybe time for La Familia, a concept that is common in the Latinx culture, to look not just those who have your last name, those who live within your home, but those within your community. Another word perhaps that we could adopt is en conjunto, in collaboration, whole person care, an approach that we try to model here at Loma Linda University Health. Now, this perhaps becomes challenging in a culture that is individualistic. Again, within healthcare, we are constantly invited to specialize, to refer. And while we highlight strengths, we could also lose the commitment to collaborate and to work in conjunto, or as Dr. Casarella says, en la familia. So looking at lo cotidiano is helpful. Coming close to those who are struggling, who the marginalized, the poor, and also working together. Medical accompaniment requires cultural commitment. At the same time, medical accompaniment requires a spiritual commitment. And perhaps the best example of this is Dr. Alex Leon, not only describing what happens in La Clínica, in the clinic, in the practical setting, but also his own journey with his little ones, with his family, as he seeks to care for those who need not just medical attention, but our love, our compassion, and sometimes our advocacy. Medical accompaniment requires a spiritual commitment. Dr. Leon reminded us that perhaps having an accompaniment theology will help us find meaning in everyday life, especially in the stress, especially in moments where we wonder why we show up to the hospital, why we show up to the clinic. But not only that, an accompaniment theology may help us help our patients make sense of what they're going through, their suffering, their pain, and perhaps shift the blame for things that society told them that was theirs, and maybe help them look at other forces that are also contributing to their suffering. Perhaps something to be mindful of. Many of us will not have the opportunities like Dr. Paul Farmer to travel around the world. But the question is, what does a first world accompaniator look like? Good questions to ask is, again, Dr. Leon says, look around. Who are the poor in my area? Who are the members of the community who have no access to the basic needs? If accompaniment is a term that Dr. Paul Farmer says means something simple like breaking bread together, who are those individuals who don't have bread, who don't have nourishment, who don't have access to the basic concepts of care? Dr. Block, in her introduction, in The Company of the Poor, the book that we quoted or it was highlighted during the presentation, emphasized something that is related to spirituality. It says the practice of accompaniment is highly personal and deeply relational. Accompaniment of the lonely poor involves walking with, not behind or in front, but besides a real person on his or her own particular journey, in his or her own particular place, and time at his or her own particular pace. Accompanying others in their struggles for survival does not have a beginning or an end, and there's no outside plan to be imposed. It often means being present to terrible suffering, being thrown into chaotic circumstances, encountering unexpected problems and difficult situations with no easy solution. And yet, accompaniment, the act of walking with one another, is, in the words of Roberto, the Cuban-American theologian, Roberto Goizueta, always fundamentally religious, sacramental act. As we think of our own practice, as we think of our own callings, perhaps it's helpful to remind ourselves that the journey of being an accompagnator is not perfect. There are limitations that we may have. And maybe psychologist Mary Watkins' book, Mutual Accompaniment and the Creation of the Commons, reminds us that sometimes our privileges, sometimes things that we have used to benefit ourselves, perhaps now it's time to put it at the disposition of others. Conclude with Dr. Block's remarks. How to be an accompaniator. Well, first of all, it requires that we model hospitality in everything we do. We offer compassion and forgiveness. Maybe it starts at home before we move into our practice. And before we address our patients, maybe with our other colleagues or other healthcare professionals within a team. To be a good accompaniator, perhaps I want to highlight a couple other suggestions that Dr. Block says. It's a long-term commitment. I am with you. Even if it's challenging, even if it's critical, I am with you till the end. It's a commitment, something that was highlighted by all 4 presenters. One more thing that I do want to highlight is to listen careful. Listen careful requires that we sometimes put our own biases aside so we can learn from others. This is cultural humility. This is what Dr. Block invited us to do. It's not perfect. Nevertheless, it's a spiritual act, an invitation to practice our faith, to look and commit to our society, our system, our community, and to live our faith. Again, the ethics of practice of accompaniment in healthcare.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barcelo, for your response to the panelists today. I would like to now give some time over to the panelists to see if you would like to respond or comment on what Dr. Barcelo just said. All right. If there's no response from the panelists, we can move into the Q&A stage of our webinar today. But first of all, I wanted to offer the panelists if you have any questions for one another.
I will ask one question of the other panelists. One thing that I've been thinking a bit more about or trying to think more about is, I think a lot of the principles of accompaniment lend themselves towards kind of individual action and encounter with another person or with a community of people. And I was just wondering if anybody here, I'd be curious to hear if anyone has any thoughts about what does it look like to orient institutions towards accompaniment, if that's even possible within accompaniment, and how we as members of institutions might cultivate institutions and groups of people that embody the ethics and practice frameworks and spirituality of accompaniment.
Actually, I could just answer briefly. I actually had something in there that I took out. Paul spent a lot of time, and a lot of our work was trying to accompany other NGOs and as well as other universities who were interested in developing departments of global health equity, as well as large institutions. Like we had a whole list of accompaniment principles at the that we tried to introduce within the United Nations. So I think yes, it's a little different. It's not as although you are dealing with people. I made that comment about open-ended contractual arrangements. So it views those kind of things differently. So yes, I do think there's definitely a way, particularly at the highest levels of trying to change policy. If you view it through the lens of accompaniment, it's something very different than just a business, relationship, because you form a partnership based on trust and you see each other as accompanying each other. So I think that's a very important aspect of it.
I'll just add one word. Cultural competency needs to be taught in both divinity schools and schools of medicine, and not just on the abstract level, but through this process of accompaniment that we've just been describing.
I think, just as we were talking about the family, I think in institutions, something that could really approximate that concept is the healthcare team. And, I'm thinking about my neuro-oncology team and in the sense of accompaniment with each other. The power differentials that we have in healthcare are not only between the wealthy and the poor, or between potentially physicians and patients, But even within the healthcare team, I alluded to this earlier when I said, in the spirit of accompaniment, I've learned from a medical student. It's the humility that I might learn something from somebody who has not obtained their medical degree, that the hierarchy as we see it may be upside down. And so I think that also applies to the interprofessional team, that accompaniment in the interprofessional team may mean physicians listening to chaplains, people who make no money for the healthcare system, and are most likely to be laid off if there's some kind of a budget cut. Learning from environmental services. And then maybe most powerfully, what I've experienced in our healthcare team has been what it means to be humble as a physician with my nurse, and to learn what that looks like. That there would not be a sense of a power differential between us. And the last thing I want to say is about that sense of entering the chaos of another. I think, in a sense, in the pandemic, what we've come out of, like, the chaos is here. The chaos is right here in our system, in our systems. And so that sense of having a long-term commitment, it could mean something like what some monks in orders of monks do when they enter a monastery, where they take a vow of stability and they say, I am going to stay here and I will not leave unless some higher authority calls me away somewhere else.
So we have a couple of questions coming in. The first one is, what are some of the primary impediments or barriers to effective accompaniment in healthcare as it is being practiced in the United States today?
I'll give a quick start. I'm limited in my experiences as a medical student, although in my clinical experiences that I've had so far, I think one thing we can name is just limitations on time. That there are tremendous pressures on clinicians to be efficient, to move quickly through clinical encounters, and to get the bare minimum information needed on one problem and then move on to the next thing. So I think that the incentives that are placed upon clinicians in a system that is trying to be as efficient as possible for the sake of probably maximizing profit, I think it's bad for patient outcomes, and it's also bad for clinicians. So I think that's one thing. And then, of course, we also live in a system, and then I got to say one other thing, we live in a system that doesn't have access to care, equal access to care for all. And so people can and cannot access this based off of socioeconomic status, based off of race, based off of geography. That's another impediment to it. And then I think lastly, I think we have to pay attention to I think what the idea of accompaniment forces us to look at ourselves. I think a lot of traditional bioethics talks a lot about cases and things that happen within health and healthcare. But when we look at ourselves within healthcare and notice that many of us are coming from a level of status or privilege that is in many ways orders of magnitude sometimes separated from patients, both geographically, economically, and everything. I think it's important for us to recognize those barriers that are inherent there and then seek to, through the idea and the principle of proximity, try to balance that in order to actually have a meaningful encounter and actually work together towards accompaniment and towards justice.
I think one of the impediments to accompaniment, ironically, may be something that helped us get into medicine, which is the spirit of competition. And I think about this especially in American healthcare, where one system is pitted against another, and some of the resources that could flow freely to serve the poor are cordoned off within systems and not shared between. I also think about that with How do we treat our market competition? If our market competition gets sick, does that please us? Or is there some sense in which our idea of the family expands to include the hospital down the street? And what does that mean for market competition if that's true? So I think that's part of it. And I'll answer maybe a second question that you did not ask, but I think one of the solutions to that is a sense of spirituality that goes beyond the competition, the sense of connectedness, and even family. That this is my brother or sister working in another system.
Well, as co-director of the Center for Christian Bioethics, I want to thank all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to teach us about the meaning and practice of accompaniment. So thank you so much, Phifer, Peter, Alex, and Jenny, for being with us today. I'm sure this webinar will be a blessing to many who will be watching us and people who are already here watching with us. So thank you so much for your contributions to the conversation today. And this concludes our webinar today.